I don't know what happened, but something about this debate.
The whole world is lost. What is he talking about? He's talking about ethnic cleansing.
No, he's not. He's literally telling the people. That quote reinforces everything I'm saying.
Attributing enough weight to the Zionist transfer predisposition in explaining what actually happened in Palestine in 1948.
You understand that transfer is not the same thing as ethnic cleansing, right?
You understand that Benny Morris has said that it's ethnic cleansing and that that's his euphemism.
Hold on. No. You understand that, like,
Yes,
for
yes.
instance, so wait,
You want me-
if they would have accepted Partition 181, is that ethnic cleansing?
What's Partition 181?
If UN General Assembly Resolution 181, which is the official
181
name given to the 1947
not
partition plan,
yes.
it was the partition plan. Okay,
Right.
if they would have accepted that, would that have been? Would you have considered that ethnic cleansing?
Absolutely not, because the resolution specifically said not to do that. It said to protect the
It
minorities.
didn't
within your
explicitly
state.
say not to do. Ethnic cleansing doesn't even exist as a term, so why would it explicitly say
They
not to
didn't
do
use
that?
Especially this guy, Javad Hashmi, just has been rent-free in my head for the last couple of days, ever since we watched it. We reacted to it on stream, start to finish, including the Q&A, and the react ended up lasting, well, the whole stream was 12 hours, but I think the react made up most of that. I think it's a really good example, especially in the Israel-Palestine conflict, to show you not really furthering any kind of like political or ideological position by doing this, but just showing you the way that people are very good at feigning this sort of academic credibility behind their arguments when they don't actually have it. For one, you should be really careful when someone constantly says, like as this guy did throughout this debate, that their position is derived from all the scholars on this topic, or many, many scholars. Because the fact is that there are lots of pop intellectuals who talk about Israel-Palestine. There are lots of academics as well, whether from the Arab world or from Israel-Palestine or from Europe or America, and they are quite divided. There's a lot, like it's because partly because the conflict is ongoing. There is so much disagreement on Israel-Palestine, even on the history where we've got loads of documentation. And you know that disagreement comes from partly the fact that we have limited documentation, or like skewed documentation. There's a lot more open archives on the Israeli side than there is in the Arab world, because the Arab countries are, you know, they're dictatorships. They're a bit less transparent. There's a lot more like documentation that you could argue might be biased towards the Zionist side, because it's like from the Western English-speaking world that supports Israel. So like there's lots of like British documents that are relevant for the mandate period, American documents, UN documents, but also the fact that the conflict is not over. The conflict is not over, and that means that both sides, even historians and academics, are very, very reluctant to concede anything on their side, because they feel like by conceding historical facts, even though it shouldn't follow, they feel like conceding will result in them undermining their country's national cause, which is a pretty toxic environment. Some people would argue that Israeli historians like Benny Morris or Avi Schleim or people like that will concede a lot more on the problematic elements of their country's history than maybe like an Arab or Palestinian historian would on their side, because Israel has a state. They have their country, right? Their UN recognized state. So to them, at least, they feel like they can concede a bit more. So there's a lot of reasons that things might be kind of skewed in one way or the other. So to appeal to like all the scholarship on a topic doesn't really get you anywhere, because scholars disagree. So when you're providing a claim, you have to be able to substantiate it like fairly well. And then the other problem I run into is when people will basically take a position which is effectively propaganda, but they will use this kind of veneer of like academic justification for it. Like, so this person here, because I'm going to focus most of this about Javad Hashmi. I had problems with a few things that Destiny said in this debate as well. Spoken to him about them. That's for a different time. But for this guy, so I think he's introduced himself here as a Harvard PhD doctor. I think that's because his channel is called Dr. Javad Hashmi. Now, he's not an academic in terms of Israel-Palestine. I think he studies like Islamic stuff in Harvard, and some of the recent work that he's done is to do with Islamic medicine, because I think his doctor credential, I don't think he's completed a PhD. He's doctor because he's a physician, right? he's not like an academic on Israel-Palestine, but again, he doesn't need to be because he's citing academics throughout the entire debate. He quotes historians, he quotes like Benny Morris, he quotes Pape, he quotes Chomsky, he quotes Herzl, or sources from the time. He quotes Ben Gurion a lot. So he brings out a lot of quotes, Ben Ami, but the problem is he uses these quotes in ways that are really, really deceptive. And in some cases, they just completely contradict what he's actually saying. So I'm going to show you a few examples of this and to show you how, just to basically give the message that because someone provides a lot of academic citation doesn't necessarily mean what they're saying is true or that they've interpreted the source material correctly at all. So the first claim that he came, I only chose 4. There are loads more claims that he made that I had issues with, but these are just 4 because, to show you to make the case. The first one I got here is him talking about Zionism being anti-Semitic. That's a really old trope, okay? We've all heard this. We've all heard people say that Zionism in and of itself is anti-Semitism, that Zionists are anti-Semites because they put a lot of pressure on non-Zionist Jews to feel like they should be part of the cause when they don't necessarily have to be, all that kind of stuff. So this is the first claim that he gives.
Yes, but Zionists had the belief that, early Zionists, including Theodor Herzl, had the anti-Semitic belief that Jews themselves are the reason for anti-Semitism, that they create anti-Semitism by their very presence because they don't belong anywhere other than their own homeland.
Why is that?
So he brings up quotes to justify this as well. Like he'll bring up quotes of Herzl saying things like, I'll be the greatest friend of the anti-Semites or whatever. So we can unpack that. This interpretation of Herzl's thinking is so bizarre to me. Herzl did believe that Jews, by their very presence outside of their own homeland, would instigate anti-Semitism. But that's not an indictment against Jews on Herzl's terms. That's an indictment against non-Jews. This is Herzl saying that Jews, as long as they're a minority, will never be accepted. Okay? That's basically Herzl's theory. Because at the time of Herzl's writing, late 1800s, is that there was, among secular Jews, 2 ways of thinking generally with how to deal with anti-Semitism, the Jewish question, especially in Europe. One was to assimilate. One was to get citizenship through, they called it emancipation back then, and to integrate into society as well as possible. To, get jobs being like doctors or lawyers or educators and things like that. It was to integrate. And if they thought if they integrated, they would become less otherized and anti-Semitism would die down. This was the majority of secular Jews at the time who believed this. Herzl himself was an assimilationist for the best part of his life, right? Before he became a Zionist. Now, Herzl eventually, and once an assimilationist, took the opposite position, which was that in part because of the Dreyfus affair, but not just that. Herzl believed eventually, as he grew older, that no amount of assimilation would save Jewish people as a minority. He said that no matter how much they assimilated, they would always be victimized. Okay? And he came up with this idea, the Zionist idea, which was already being practiced a little bit by very small minorities. But his idea was that the Jewish question in Europe would never be solved unless Jewish people had their own state. That's the only place that they could go where they guaranteed their own safety, right? Assimilation wouldn't help. So and that was a minority opinion. Like Zionism was a very fringe opinion amongst Jewish people because most of them were assimilationists. If you read his quotes, honestly, it's so easy to explain this though, right? Like this is him speaking in the Jewish State where he says, "We have honestly endeavored everywhere to merge ourselves in the social life of surrounding communities and to preserve the faith of our fathers. We are not permitted to do so. In vain we are loyal patriots, our loyalty in some places running to extremes. In vain do we make the same sacrifices of life and property as our fellow citizens. In vain do we strive to increase the fame of our native land in science and art, or her wealth by trade and commerce. In countries where we have lived for centuries, we are still cried down as strangers. It is useless, therefore, for us to be loyal patriots, as we were the, whatever that word is, the Huguenots, who were forced to emigrate, if we could only be left in peace. But I think we shall not be left in peace, for old prejudices against us still lie deep in the hearts of people." He's very clear. How could you assume that this is an anti-Semitic belief? It's insane, right? So it's interesting because he's characterizing everything else about Herzl correctly here, that their presence would inspire anti-Semitism that they should have their own homeland instead. But this has nothing to do with him being anti-Semitic himself. Same with assimilationism. He says, we might perhaps be able to merge ourselves entirely into surrounding races if these were to leave us in peace for a period of 2 generations. But they will not leave us in peace. For a little period, they manage to tolerate us, and then their hostility breaks out again and again. We are one people. Our enemies have made us one without our consent, as repeatedly happens in history. The Jewish state is filled with this kind of stuff. Like, it is so clear that he's not holding this, like, Jews responsible for this. He's holding non-Jews, like particularly European Christians, responsible for this. Because to him, anti-Semitism was this, basically, for whatever reason, a medieval way of thinking that had just never been able to get dislodged from European thought. And given that he wrote this and made these arguments 30 years or so, 34 years before the rise of Nazism in Germany, he was correct, because the German Jews in Germany who were victimized by the Nazis were as integrated as they'd ever been. They were the most integrated they'd ever been. And look what happened to them, right? And the evidence he uses to try and back this up, it just doesn't make any sense. He uses a quote where he talks about Herzl calling himself the great friend of anti-Semites in Europe, right? Because he liaised with a lot of people who were anti-Semites, who wanted Jews out of Europe. But that's because he thought the only way for Jews to save themselves was to be in their own state. And Europeans who were anti-Semitic wanted Jews out of Europe. So just because it's a coincidence that they have that same desire does not mean that he, like, is himself anti-Semitic, right? Like, imagine if some Jewish philanthropist took 1,000 Jews out of Nazi Germany and said, you know what, in a way, I've been a really good friend to the Nazis by doing this, like in their diary or whatever. Would that make them anti-Semitic? Like, no, of course not. But the problem is that this is just a trope. It's a trope that Zionism was anti-Semitic. And what this guy, Hashmi, does is he started with that conclusion, and he tries to use historical examples and quotes to work back into it. The example of him doing this is probably most egregious here with his retelling of the First Zionist Congress. So,
yeah. And the reason, and most Jews at that time, they thought this was incredibly anti-Semitic, and they didn't agree with the Zionists, and that's why the first Zionist Congress, they were initially going to meet in Munich, and they had to relocate because both the Reform Jews and the Orthodox Jews protested and said, you can't have this anti-Semitic conference here, and so they had to relocate to Basel. So that is the case of Zionism being a fringe anti-Semitic idea initially.
So
this he's pointing to a very clear example here, and I can't tell if maybe someone told him this and that's why he thinks that, or what would be much worse is that he actually knows the true story of what happened with the First Zionist Congress and has just decided to lie about it. Because the First Zionist Congress, which was supposed to happen in Munich, it was opposed by secular and religious Jews, but not because they thought it was anti-Semitic. That's a really interesting sleight of hand there. Religious Jews opposed it because they didn't like the idea of secular Jews going to create the Jewish state, because to them, that's something that's supposed to happen through the Messiah, right? You're not supposed to do that of your own accord. Like, that's the work of the supernatural or whatever. That's the work of God. But for the secular Jews, they did believe that the First Zionist Congress would give rise to anti-Semitism. Not that they thought the Congress itself was anti-Semitic, that Zionism itself was. The reason secular Jews opposed the First Zionist Congress on the grounds of anti-Semitism was because they thought it would result in a rise of anti-Semitism from non-Jews, because they were assimilationists. And they thought that the holding of a Zionist Congress in Germany would basically present German non-Jews with this image of separatist, disloyal Jewish nationalists who are talking about seceding or like getting out of the country and building a new homeland somewhere else. That's why they opposed it. They opposed it because they thought it would create an anti-Semitic backlash and endanger Jewish assimilation and integration in statehood and citizenship, because they had just recently been emancipated, like 20 years earlier. That's why they opposed it. And you can even see the opposition to the Congress is written down. It's like there are records of it. In a Munich newspaper, they published this notice where they accused Zionists of being water to the mill of anti-Semitism. The water to the mill they're talking about is them going against integration. And they also warned, again, in no uncertain terms, that the anti-Semitic movement, i.e. not the Zionists, like the non-Zionists, like non-Jews, would gain new sustenance from this badly prepared anachronistic Congress, which is attempting to unite elements that cannot be united for long. Like, there's no way he knows about this story and concluded that the majority of Jews thought Zionism itself was anti-Semitic. Like, there's no way that he got that from this story. So, but it's interesting that he mentions the story, and he mentions that Jews and Orthodox Jews protested, so he knows that all happened, but somehow he's managed to inject this part that I've never even seen that before. Like did he make it up, or did he? I don't know. It's so baffling. I don't know. What's interesting is that this kind of battle between Zionists and assimilationists actually became like really, really toxic, because in one action that actually was maybe potentially anti-Semitic was actually from the anti-Zionists in the just before the First World War, because as the Zionists and the anti-Zionist Jews were at odds with each other, in 1914 in Germany, after the Zionists kind of were starting to make achievements in different parts of Germany, a group called the Anti-Zionist Committee actually issued out a statement in the German press where they were warning German non-Jews against the danger of Zionist machinations in Germany. And they accused Zionists of trying to like ignite amongst the Jewish people a national Jewish chauvinism, which would place us at odds with our fellow Christian Germans. This was actually done by anti-Zionist Jews. The fact that they actually like went to the non-Jewish public and sort of like put a target on the back of Zionists and portrayed them as like disloyal traitors. And the fact that they did that in Germany to a group of Jews just on the eve of World War I, painting a group of Jewish people as traitors, that's actually a kind of an anti-Semitic action, because obviously after World War I, the big popular conspiracy theory about why the Germans lost was that Jews betrayed Germany. And then this is after Herzl died, this particular event. But in that context of division between Zionist and anti-Zionist Jews, the one example that Javad gives, which could be the most convincing of Herzl showing anti-Semitic thought, is when he refers an article called Mauschel, which is written by Herzl, but he published it under a pseudonym just after the Zionist Congress, so after the rejection from the assimilationists. And in his frustration, Herzl writes this piece pseudonymously, basically deriding anti-Zionist Jews. And in that little screed that he writes, 2 pages or 3 pages long, he uses quite a few tropes that are quite anti-Semitic. Like the imagery he uses is anti-Semitic. He basically describes like Mauschel to him. We can even see if there's a passage from it we can look at. Like the word that he uses there is to refer to Jewish people who are so assimilationist and are so obsessed with assimilating that they'll basically end up like fulfilling the stereotype of the Jew, like betraying their own, just trying to get wealthy or just trying to look out for themselves without looking out for the group. And in so doing, he basically like uses anti-Semitic stereotypes to describe this particular kind of anti-Semitic Jew. And like there are the Jews and there are the Mauschel. Like if there's a good modern analogy, it's kind of like the Chris Rock bit when he talks about there are 2 kinds of black people, the black people and the N-word. It's a bit like that. Now, this is probably Herzl at his worst in terms of being like prone to like outbursts, like an anti-Semitic outburst. But to say that this meant that Zionism itself and his Zionist thinking was driven by anti-Semitism it's a complete stretch. It's ridiculous, because if this is the evidence you're going to use to say that like the entire ideology of Zionism was anti-Semitic in and of itself, even though he hasn't been able to prove that up until here, like, how does that work? Would you say that if like Malcolm X calling MLK an Uncle Tom for his nonviolent advocacy, would that make Malcolm X like racist against black people holistically? No, I don't think so. I don't think so. I think internal critique amongst like oppressed racial groups is actually like it's a very complex dialogue that happens. It's like the discourse there and the tenor is very complex. And to use this to prove that Herzl was anti-Semitic it's insane. It's just horseshit. And the evidence that he gives that Jews thought Zionism was anti-Semitic at the time, I have not seen any evidence for this. The example he gives is actually not evidence for it at all, though. So Yeah. So that's the first example. The second one he gives is where he says that Zionist lobbyists were pressuring Western governments to reject Jewish refugees in the 1940s.
And you know what the Zionists did?
They did a whole wave of
Jewish
terrorism from 40 to 44.
Not only that, they prevented immigration of Jews to other countries. They put on pressure for the U.S. and the British not to accept Jewish refugees. Ben Gurion has a famous quote. Ben Gurion has a famous quote where he says that I would rather I save only half of Europe's Jewish children and they come to Palestine rather than all of the Jewish children if they go elsewhere.
You live in quotes.
So
I love your quotes. That is true. When he was having a conversation about how he felt about people fleeing, but that wasn't a policy position, and he certainly didn't encourage people not to accept Jewish refugees. He didn't need to. The entire world hated Jews. Zionist it didn't matter.
Lobbied for the immigration restrictions. In fact, they even... There was even a famous case where they bombed a ship, dude.
Okay. So the Zionist lobbyists lobbying to restrict immigration from Jews to Western countries in the late 30s to escape Nazism. The quote's real from Ben Gurion. He did say, just a month after Kristallnacht, actually, he said that if it was possible to save all the Jewish children of Germany by transporting them to England and only half by transferring them to the land of Israel, he would choose the latter. For before us lies not only the numbers of these children, but the historical reckoning of the people of Israel. So this is a pretty cold, almost sociopathic thing to say. I think he said it in private to the Mapai Central Committee. This isn't a policy, though. This isn't them lobbying European or Western governments to reject Jewish refugees. I have no idea why, if there's evidence of that. This quote is no evidence of it, though. But, okay, how do you explain this? So, Ben Gurion said this just after Kristallnacht, okay? He also said it not too long after the Evian conference. And the Evian conference was where delegates from 32 countries discussed the Jewish people who were fleeing Nazi Germany, okay? And all but one of those countries, the Dominican Republic, every other country refused to admit refugees. They said, it's really bad that this is happening. We sympathize with them, but we're not going to let them in. So, incidentally, there were no Jewish people at the Evian conference lobbying to stop immigration to those countries, okay? Those countries did that by themselves. Incidentally, there was one Zionist who was there representing the Jewish movement, the Yishuv, and it was actually a future prime minister. It was Golda Meir. She was representing the Yishuv at the Evian conference as her title was the Jewish Observer from Palestine. We know that Golda Meir was not pressuring anyone to reject Jewish refugees because she wasn't even allowed to speak. She wasn't even allowed to sit with the delegates. She was sitting in the audience. She watched. She didn't do anything. She went to the press and complained about this whole like fake sympathy not followed up by any action. But she didn't pressure them, nor did any other Zionist lobby pressure like Britain or the United States or whatever to reject Jewish refugees. There's no evidence of that. She watched, and actually in her autobiography, she wrote about it. She said, sitting there in that magnificent hall and listening to the delegates of 32 countries rise each in turn to explain how much they would have liked to take in substantial numbers of refugees and how unfortunate it was that they were not able to do so was a terrible experience. I don't think that anyone who didn't live through it can understand what I felt at Evian, a mixture of sorrow, rage, frustration, and horror. I wanted to get up and scream at them all. Don't you know that these numbers are human beings? People who may spend the rest of their lives in concentration camps or wandering around the world like lepers if you don't let them in? She was furious at the Evian conference. And when the press asked her for comments afterwards, she said as much. But coming back to Ben Gurion, this is the backdrop against which he's saying what he said about saving half the Jews to stay in Israel rather than all of them going to England, is because England had just rejected Jewish refugees from Germany. So the way Ben Gurion thought about Zionism is that he believed that, like Herzl, he believed that Jewish people were never going to get saved in Europe. They were always going to be victims. So if they got saved in England, for example, then it would only be a matter of time before they'd be pogromed and attacked there, right? That was more or less his rationale. So his way of thinking in terms of Zionism was always that it wasn't about individuals. It wasn't about saving a few Jews here and there. It was about saving the Zionist project so that there can be a more permanent and a more eternal safe space, quote unquote, for Jewish people. Like that was his reasoning. And he held to that all the way throughout the war as well. He said, "It is our duty to uphold the banner of comprehensive Zionism, which aims not for individual redress, but for the deliverance of the people as a whole." Throughout the war, he maintained this position, arguing in 1944 that history has proved that we cannot survive as individuals. And if you look at where that quote comes from, there's like a whole reasoning for it as well, that he was expressing that sentiment, that very brutal sentiment, in response not just to Kristallnacht, but also to the complete failure of the Evian conference. And also because, remember, this is not long before Britain, or kind of during the period where Britain was effectively turning its back on Zionism. So he believed that the Jewish question could only be solved through the formation of a Jewish state. That was the only way. Saving a few people here and there from Nazi Germany was going to do nothing in the long term. Now, that's a very cold way to think. It's a very sociopathic way to think about it. If you want to argue that, for example, Ben-Gurion basically viewed everything that was happening in Europe strictly through the lens of Zionism, often in brutal terms, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, he did do that, yeah. That's why he doesn't actually talk that much about the suffering of Jews in Europe throughout the war. He doesn't talk about it that much because it's not really something that he has any, in his view, he doesn't really have any power to solve it anyway. Like, it's not his problem. His problem is starting the Jewish state so that something like that can never happen again. That's his opinion. And you can criticize that. It's a pretty cold way to think, but it's not the Zionists, what's the original claim? Lobbying Western governments to reject immigration, Jewish immigration. That's not evidence of that, because there is no evidence of that. There's no evidence that they did that. They were silenced by the Evian conference, and they were actually quite broken when every other country apart from Dominican Republic rejected Jews. So again, it's like, even though you've got the quote, like the kind of, not many people know this quote, actually. It's a bit more obscure in mainstream discourse, but bringing up that like esoteric reference and then using it to look like, and I guess to like a more passive listener, you might even think like, oh, maybe there is some like credibility behind this claim because, you know, he's citing the old quote from like Ben-Gurion's biographer. Yeah, like you'd think there's something there, but it's not. Again, it's just starting with your conclusion and walking back from it. He mentions the example of them bombing a ship. He doesn't elaborate on that, but I think bombing the ship, there were instances when Zionist militias, I think it was actually the Haganah, it wasn't Irgun or Lehi, would place little explosives in ships that were being taken to deport Jewish refugees who had come illegally to Palestine. So late 30s, early 40s, a lot of Jewish people trying to escape Europe illegally took ships to Mandri, Palestine. Mandri, Palestine is run by the British. They catch people doing this illegally and they deport them back to Europe. So occasionally, the Haganah would place explosives in these boats to try and disable them. There was one instance where the explosion was a lot stronger than they expected it to be, and it killed like, I think it might have been up like 100 people. It killed a bunch of people on the boat, basically, a bunch of Jewish refugees who were about to be deported. Again, that's not evidence of them, like that's the backdrop to them bombing a ship. They bombed the ship because they were trying to disable it, to stop refugees being deported back to Europe. It was nothing to do with them stopping Jewish immigration to Europe or Jewish people getting saved by European countries. So, yeah. Okay. Number 3. The 1948 war was started by Zionists.
I already told you that it was not the Palestinians who launched the war.
Who was it?
Okay? It was the Zionists who launched the war. Specifically, it was the Irgun and the Lehi. The only reason why...
The Irgun and the Lehi...
The Lehi? Okay, and his citation for this, I think, is Benny Morris, right?
And Benny Morris's book will also prove this, is that Lehi and Stern Gang were the ones who, through an escalatory process, started the war. Because they kept bombing Arab villages and
in
Arab
response
civilians.
to Arabs attacking Jews.
No.
As they had been in the prior 2 decades.
They attacked. So the Haganah had the policy of restraint for a couple of months in which they only did defensive retaliation. Now, their version of defense was if an Arab village, even one person attacked from that, will attack the entire village. That's their defensive, and that's Israel's policy. Now,
okay, so a couple of claims there. One, that it was actually, and Benny Morris's book apparently shows this, that the Irgun and the Stern Gang, Lehi, were the ones who started the war by carrying out terror attacks. They're the ones who started the escalations after the partition plan, causing the civil war. And the second claim is that the Haganah did have a restraint policy, but their restraint policy was, someone one person attacks you, so you attack the entire village. Okay. Can we make a timestamp every time he mispronounces something? No, you can do that. I don't care about that. I know he made fun of Destiny for calling it a caliphate, so it's ironic, but whatever. So he cites Benny Morris, and it's interesting because if you go to the birth of the refugee problem, we can actually do this one here because you can get this one online. If you go to the birth of the refugee problem, it's very easy to see. You can be quick. You can just do a little quick rebuttal and find here that he's basically saying, it cannot be stressed too strongly that while this is not a military history, the events it describes, cumulatively amounting to the Palestinian Arab exodus, occurred in wartime and were a product, direct and indirect, of that war. A war that the Palestinians started. So obviously Benny Morris does not think the Irgun and the Lehi started the war. He thinks the Palestinians started it. Okay. But he does have an answer for that, so be careful.
The 47 war was initiated by Arabs. And the 48 War of Independence was initiated.
It was done by the Irgun.
You told me that there was a list. That's fine. I don't know.
It was by the Irgun and Lehi.
Okay.
And the only reason Benny Morris is able to say that it's not because he excludes the Lehi and the Stern Gang. He says, oh, they don't represent the mainstream Zionism, so he's able to. But he wouldn't do that with the Palestinian side, right?
And in 67.
Okay. So apparently Morris provides the evidence but doesn't conclude it because he's excluding the Irgun and Lehi. Now, that would be really egregious if Benny did that, because it wouldn't even make sense. Because if you said that the Irgun and Lehi attacks don't count because they're not the Haganah, they were fringe terrorists, then the Arab attacks wouldn't count either, because the initial Arab attacks came from al-Husseini agents and irregulars. They weren't the Arab armies. They weren't like the official forces. So it wouldn't make any sense. It'd be really egregious if he did that. However, does he do that? Well, let's look at Benny Morris's timeline, because if you go to the Wikipedia for attacks from the Irgun and Lehi, the Irgun were the first ones to attack, to launch attacks after the partition plan, after November 29th, 47. So you have to go from there, 47, 48. The first attack from either the Irgun or Lehi was December 11th, and it was near Haifa, where they killed 13 people. So if you wanted to see if that adds up with what Benny is saying, what you'd have to do is you would just have to look up the Battle of Haifa and see if that's supported by his work. So it's quite easy to confirm this or deny it. So Battle of Haifa starts here. They talk about the partition resolution. And here we can see, beginning on December 11th, there were Etzel is Irgun, by the way, Etzel operatives who began to throw bombs at Arab crowds and buses. So that's there. The Irgun attack is there. But if you look just earlier in the paragraph, Husseini agents and irregulars sporadically launched attacks on Jews beginning on the 7th of December with ambushes against traffic moving through Wadi Rushmiya. From then on, there were almost daily exchanges of fire along the same neighborhoods, almost always initiated by Arabs. So he's not excluding the Irgun and Lehi from starting the escalation because they're irregular terrorists. He's not saying that. He's including them, but then also including the fact that the fighting was initiated 4 days earlier. And on December 7th, this was when on Irgun radio, where they literally put out a broadcast that said, like, effectively, no more fucking around. Like, it effectively said, no more playing nice or whatever, now's the time to attack. And then from then on, the Irgun did start doing terror attacks, and they were bombing buses and crowds and cafes and shit like that. So they were engaged in acts that contributed to the rise of violence, but not the initiation. The initiation came from Husseini's guys and from the irregulars. So again, it's interesting that he's mentioning Morris there, because it does sound like he's familiar with the source material. Is Wikipedia missing attacks? No. Wikipedia has the first Etzel attack on December 11th, which is the first attack. Their first attack was in Haifa, but it came 4 days before Arab attacks, 4 days after. But again, the way he words these statements, it does sound like he's familiar with the source material, because he even says here, through an escalatory process, like that word that he uses, that term, that phrasing he uses there is in Morris's book, The 48 War, when he talks about an escalatory process. But for the Irgun and Lehi, he talks about them contributing to an escalatory process, not that they started the war. The easy historical consensus is that after the partition plan, the initial attacks came from Arab irregulars. It came from Husseini's men. The Ergun and Leahy contributed to the escalations, and then they came after. Like, it's just again, he's just citing Morris dishonestly, completely. What he says about Haganah policy is also kind of mischaracterized. When he was saying that the Haganah policy was defensive retaliation, and what, like, if an Arab village or even one person attacks, then they attack the entire village. Again, maybe there's a historian who believes that. I don't know who they are, but he cites Morris again. So again, we can just look. And in the Birth of the Refugee Problem, this is one of the circulars from the Levanoni Brigade, which eventually split up into Golani and one of the northern ones. And this is what Morris describes as, in effect, Yishuv Haganah policy down to the end of March. So from November, the partition plan, to March 1948, for those sort of 4 months, this is what Morris describes as effectively the policy. And this is the circular that was quite widely distributed. It says, we must avoid as far as possible killing plain civilians, and to make an effort as far as possible to always hit the criminals themselves, the bearer of arms, those who carry out the attacks. We do not want to spread the disturbances and to unite the Arab public around the Mufti and his gangs. Any indiscriminate massacre of Arab civilians causes the consolidation of the Arab masses around the inciters. And then another one from the Haganah, January 48. Reprisal attacks are not to spread the disturbances to areas so far unaffected. There should be an effort to hit the guilty while acknowledging the possibility of precise individual targeting, to distinguish between friendly and unfriendly Arab villages, identifying and killing gang leaders, harassing a settlement by firing at it and mining, organizing ambushes to hit transport to and from the settlement, punitive operation against the village in order to hit the adult male combatants. Again, this is what effectively the Haganah did up until March 1948. The escalation, that's all to do with the siege of Jerusalem, topic for a different time. Again, this is nothing to do with, this is complete opposite of what he's saying. He's just completely mischaracterized what the mainstream Haganah policy was in this period. I think there's another thing he said here that I didn't actually end up quoting. There's another part in here where he actually says that the Haganah were deliberately escalating because they wanted pretext, or they were annoyed that there was a lack of pretext. But again, it's the complete opposite. Like, the official Zionist policy of this time was like small-scale defensive reprisals. The Ergun and Leahy disobeyed this and went their own way with lots of attacks, many of which were not provoked at all, say like in the Damascus Gate in Jerusalem. But again, this has nothing to do, like, that's a minority policy. Like, the Haganah like hunted down Ergun and Leahy militants later on in the war to literally stop them from going against the script like this. Who do you like more, Arabs or Jews? I'm a both sider, okay? We were shitting on Traveling Israel the other day, so now we're doing this guy. Okay. Do one more. This is probably the worst one, I think. It's the worst one because, again, like, he is accurately quoting the source material, but the embellishments and the kind of like the sort of improvising that he does around it is just like, it either demonstrates like a complete lack of understanding or just like dishonesty, but we'll see. Negotiating the right of return.
None of these plans have made clear what the right of return would look like. Like, there hasn't been a single commitment to an actual number.
So do you think that, number one is, do you think that Palestinians have made dramatic concessions on the right of return, or have they been intransigent on this issue like you have said in the past?
I don't think they've ever made a concession on the right of return. That's my understanding.
Okay, so your understanding is incorrect. Okay, and if you had actually watched the debate that you claimed that you watched between Norman Finkelstein and Avish...
I would never waste my time.
Okay, but you said that you watched it, right? But Camp David 2000, demand on the Palestinian side was 10 to 20% of the total Palestinian refugees. Okay, that's in Ben-Ami, Scars of War, page 249.
They didn't, but the Palestinians didn't accept that.
That's from the Palestinian side.
No.
Yes, Scars of War. Okay.
That's just not true. They did not accept. They absolutely didn't. Part of the words.
Okay. To be honest, it's irrelevant if they went after Leahy and Ergun late in the war when talking about initiation of hostilities. No, the point of bringing that up is because Haganah policy was not the same as the Ergun or Leahy, like he was saying or suggesting. He was suggesting that maybe the Haganah had a different way of wording it, but they were effectively doing the same thing. Like that thing he described of if one person attacks, you go and take out the entire village. That was like Ergun and Lehi would have done that at the beginning, but not the Haganah. So they did that later, but like near the end of the war, but not the period he's talking about. Anyway. So he mentions Scars of War for this claim, which is good because we have that book. Page 249. Now I know this already, or I knew this already because it's also in Prophets Without Honor. Scars of War. Do I have it? Or did I get rid of it? Oh no. Or have I quoted it here? Oh, I quoted it here. Okay. Shit, hang on. Did I really get rid of Scars of War? Why? Why would I do that? Oh, I didn't. I do have it. Just didn't show up when I put in Scars of War in my Control F. That's so strange. Okay, so the way he presents this number, this 10 to 20%, as the Palestinian demand, or the demand from the Palestinian side. Again, I don't know if someone else gave him this quote, but there's no way he would say that if he'd actually read even the full page. This is how. I'll show you. Okay, so 249 is where he gets his quote from. So this is the talks at Camp David. Okay. Throughout, Arafat perceives himself as a warrior engaged in a mythological campaign of moral decision against a state born in sin, which must be forced to acknowledge Palestinian justice by opening a wide window to the implementation of the refugees' right of return. How many refugees do you intend to ask should return? Nabil Shath was asked by the president in the negotiations on refugees at Camp David. His answer was between 10 and 20% of the total number. Do you really expect Israel to accept between 400,000 and 800,000 refugees? Is this the agreement you expect them to subscribe to? Another person says, we insist on the right of every refugee to go back to his home, was Akram Hania's response. In other words, this is not, first of all, this is not the Palestinian side's demand for refugees. This is a suggestion brought up by one negotiator, immediately followed up by Arafat's confidant, I think, one of Arafat's confidants, that it should also include everyone having the right to return home. It's not an on-paper final offer. It's just a suggestion brought up in negotiations. And incidentally, if you read Ben-Ami beyond just this quote, we know that Nabil Shath didn't actually even know if Arafat would have accepted this number. That he didn't know if 10 to 20% would have been what Arafat would have accepted. Because if you look at Prophets Without Honor, which is also Ben-Ami, page 180, Shath said that Arafat was interested in the return of 300,000 refugees, essentially the entire Palestinian refugee population in Lebanon, whom Arafat always referred to as my brothers and beloved refugees of Lebanon. But Shath had truly no idea what the number would be that Arafat would say yes to, and he therefore added that all the refugees be allowed a year to decide whether they wanted to return to the Palestinian state or to Israel. Like, this is not a commitment. We don't know. Like, maybe Arafat would have put this one on the table. We're never going to know because he never put that on the table. Like, the whole point with Arafat was that he would turn things down and not make counteroffers. And as far as the refugees go, there was no counteroffer from Arafat. And we'll go a bit further to find out. But you're being deliberately retarded if you genuinely can't understand what the point he was making, then you're genuinely retarded. You're being retarded. What the like... It's not a final Palestinian offer. And also the fact that he would read this and not include that it's followed up with every refugee having the right to go back home. Why then is this the demand and not this one, right? Why is this paragraph supersede this one? Did Shath have more negotiating power than Hania? Did either of them know what Arafat would have said yes to? Do we know what Arafat would have said yes to? No. To all those questions. Even if you go down the page, this is at least an American interpretation of what was going on here. Where is it? Rob Malley, in the analysis of the summit he co-authored with Hussein Agha, repeated this remark. Indeed, the Palestinians' principal failing is that from the beginning of the Camp David summit onward, they were unable either to say yes to the American ideas or to present a cogent and specific counter-proposal of their own. That's true. Like, that's why the example of a demand that this person brings up is one negotiator says one thing, the other person says another thing, and neither seem to have the authority to make the final decision anyway. So neither of them know what Arafat's going to say yes to anyway. So that's not what you would say is the demand from the Palestinian side. Like, and as far as knowing what Arafat would have said yes to, I pose that I would pose that we don't know either, but we don't need to guess necessarily what Arafat wanted, because apparently Javad gives us the actual answer for a concession that Arafat made on right of return. So this is the one he gives here.
So meanwhile, as far as Arafat, he agreed to no right of return and was just seeking to get refugees
absolutely
accepted into the Palestinian
not.
State. Yes, he only wanted.
Arafat agreed to no right of return? It's such an unbelievable statement.
You can read it in page 400, expressing his concern.
Page 400 of what?
Can I finish?
Can you tell me what you're reading out of, please? If you're going to live in quotes, at least. Yeah, page 400 of what?
Clayton Swisher's book?
No, I don't. What's that called?
Book that's literally on the Camp David Accords. It's the most famous book on this issue.
Okay, gotcha.
Okay, so, all right. So,
and he says that Arafat gave up the right of return?
So he wanted the right of return only for the Palestinian state, which is like giving it up from Israel, which would risk its demographic nature, correct?
There's no shot that Arafat ever agreed to this, but...
Okay, all right. So yeah, you don't know what you're talking about.
Clearly not,
okay?
Yeah.
So that's number one. So he just wanted reassurance that it wouldn't be under Israel's prerogative.
For a claim like this, you don't even necessarily need a source if you're familiar with the Israel-Palestine conflict at all, because I feel like if you were an academic even, and you had to talk about the peace process, you had to write like a piece about it, I'm pretty sure you could just say that Arafat would have never conceded to a right of return just to the Palestinian state. I'm pretty sure you could say that in academia, and they wouldn't even want you to cite it, because it's a truism. It's just something that everyone knows. We know that as well because that was the Israeli position at Camp David. It was actually one of the initial, like the very first Israeli position at Camp David for refugees, was that basically right of return is that we don't want any of it in Israel, but Palestinian state, do whatever the fuck you want. That's like the start line Israeli position, which they actually moved away from after that, because they eventually moved away from that position by saying that there would be like humanitarian considerations, maybe at the Clinton parameters, or that there would be concessions made in terms of like they would pay for resettlements, so that they're doing like a kind of compensation rather than return. So the idea that Arafat like agreed to this it's insane. It's like it's not backed up by anything. And he does say it's from what page 400 of Clayton Swisher's book on Camp David. But what's really puzzling about that is that if you go to Clayton Swisher's book, page 400, it doesn't lead you to Arafat agreeing to anything. It leads you to this. I think it leads you to this letter that Arafat wrote to Clinton after receiving the Clinton parameters. So after Camp David fails, Clinton pulls together this proposal trying to solve all the problems of territory, Jerusalem, refugees, security, submits it to Israel, Palestine, and says, you've got X amount of days to accept this, take it or leave it. And before giving his... Eventually, both sides accepted it. They accepted the parameters and agreed to negotiate. There's a contention about the reservations that each side had and whether whose reservations were more in or outside the parameters. It's for a different time. But before accepting the parameters, Arafat sends this letter to the president. But this is not the acceptance of the parameters. It's not him agreeing to anything. It's just him saying, this is really like exciting. We're going to have lots of clarifications. He even says, I need clear answers to many questions. And like, I want to continue the work. And I have many questions relating to the return of refugees to their homes and villages, negative experience with the return of displaced Palestinians to the West Bank and Gaza. And then he goes on to talk about how the withdrawal period in the parameters is too long, so he's disputing that. I don't want to procrastinate or waste time. We need a real opportunity. I have many questions. I need maps, details, clarifications. This isn't a yes or a no. It's just an Arafat letter. It's not even, like, I think some people might characterize it as the typical Arafat, like, oh yeah, I'm positive, but I'm also not going to concede anything or whatever. Like, it's not even that. It's just him saying, like, yeah, thanks, I've got questions. Let's try something, right? It's not the acceptance. It's not the letter of acceptance. He's not agreeing to anything. But this is the page that he cited from, it's going to look different here because it's a PDF. But yeah, this is the page 400 that he's referring to. So I don't know if he just thought he could get away with this or because he read it and misunderstood it, because no one on the Israeli or Palestinian side considers this to be the Palestinian letter of acceptance of the Clinton parameters. No one sees it that way. Even this author, he just describes it as Arafat showing detailed interest whilst listing reservations. This is not the acceptance letter. It's like, what he's given here is that it's useless. It's nothing. We can look at the actual letter of acceptance as well and find even more evidence, I think, that this claim he's making about Arafat is completely false. Because if Arafat agreed to right of return only to a Palestinian state, i.e. just conceded the Israeli position, why would the Palestinian negotiating team, a few days after that letter, write this? I'll just read the whole thing, just to give you the impression. So this is the letter of acceptance to the Clinton parameters, 4th of January. On the issue of Palestinian refugees driven from their homes as a result of the establishment of the State of Israel, the United States proposed that both sides recognize the right of Palestinian refugees to return either to historic Palestine or to their homeland, but added that the agreement should make clear that there is no specific right of return to what is now Israel. Instead, it proposed 5 possible final homes for the refugees: the State of Palestine, areas in Israel transferred to Palestine in the land swap, rehabilitation in the host countries, resettlement in the third countries, and admission to Israel. All refugees would have the right to return to the State of Palestine. However, rehabilitation in host countries, resettlement in third countries, and admission to Israel would all depend on the policies of those individual countries. The United States proposal reflects a wholesale adoption of the Israeli position that the implementation of the right of return be subject entirely to Israel's discretion. It is important to recall that in Resolution 194, long regarded as the basis for a just settlement of the refugee problem, calls for the return of Palestinian refugees to their homes, wherever located, not to their homeland or to historic Palestine. And this is their claim here, which completely goes against what he's saying about Arafat. The essence of the right of return is choice. Palestinians should be given the option to choose where they wish to settle, including return to the homes from which they were driven. There is no historical precedent for a people abandoning their fundamental right of return to their homes, whether they were forced to leave or fled in war. We will not be the first people to do so. Recognition of the right of return and the provision of choice to refugees is a prerequisite for the closure of the conflict. The Palestinians are prepared to think flexibly and creatively about the mechanisms for implementing the right of return. In many discussions with Israel, mechanisms for implementing this right in such a way as to end the refugee status and refugee problem, as well as to otherwise accommodate Israeli concerns, have been identified and elaborated in some detail. The United States proposal fails to make reference to any of these advances and refers back to earlier Israeli negotiating positions. Again, apparently this Israeli negotiating position they are challenging the United States on is the one that Arafat accepted 4 days earlier. Like, it doesn't make any sense. It's so stupid. In addition, the United States proposal fails to provide any assurance that refugee rights to restitution and compensation will be fulfilled. So this is not an acceptance of what Javad said. It's them saying that choice is the important thing to us, recognition of the right is important, but we will think flexibly about it. Now, if you want to criticize the Israeli position here, because Sundowner is soying out about saying that I haven't read any Palestinian negotiators talking about Camp David. So I've read Khalidi, and I've read enough secondary sources on Nabil Shath, in particular his talks with Yossi Beilin, to know that amongst the Palestinian negotiating team, maybe not Arafat, there were proposals to do with recognizing the right in a way that would still consider Israel's demographic concerns. I know that this was a proposal that was brought up by negotiators, and that Israel, unfortunately, to their detriment, just saw any right of return, even that phraseology, as a death sentence for Israel, which I don't think they should have. I think they could have recognized the right of return, provided that closure, and also implemented it in a way that would not result in like over 500,000 people coming to Israel and like doing the demographic thing. That's my understanding of a Palestinian proposal. Now, Arafat's position, I don't know. I don't think we know, okay? Like, because he unfortunately was a little bit nebulous in how he... You're so mad. I love you. Okay. Unfortunately, Arafat was a little bit too nebulous for us to know, but from people like Khalidi, or definitely from Nabil Shath, like, yeah, there was probably something there that wasn't explored well enough. But this is absolutely not Arafat accepting the right of return only for the Palestinian state. And I think this particular sentence here just betrays a complete lack of basic understanding of like what happened during these negotiations. Like, I don't know how you can cite like 400 plus page books on this topic that you've supposedly read, I'd imagine, or at least read the relevant parts of, and then to come out with a claim like that. Holy shit. That's just really bizarre. Anyway, those were 4 examples. I know there were other ones, like his mischaracterization of what the Golda Meir King Abdullah talks, misrepresentations of what else? The responses to the Clinton parameters from both sides. Yeah, the misrepresentation of that Avi Schleim quote regarding the Ehud Olmert negotiations with Abbas. But in any case, those I think are 4 quite clear examples of just because someone has academic credentials and is able to come to you with quotes and page numbers from scholars and all that, does not necessarily mean that what they're saying is factual or well thought out or anything. Because all too often, I think citations like this and this kind of like method is just used as a kind of like way of dressing up what is really just propaganda. Like, yeah. So, moral of the story: if someone comes to you with a few quotes and authors and page numbers claiming to have the hard facts, one is double check that the thing they're citing is actually proving their initial claim, because it might not always, like the Ben Gurion thing with the lobbyists. Or just, I don't know, check the source and look for maybe like 1 page before and 1 page after, or even just read the whole chapter. Because my guess is you're probably going to get a slightly more nuanced impression of what's being said. Anyway, that's my little project from the last couple of days. And I think I might do that with different people as well, because I know you can do this with, you can actually do this with the sources themselves as well, like the actual academics that are being cited. I know there have been examples of Benny Morris saying things and then citing them either incorrectly or just saying things that are wrong. There are plenty of examples of Ilan Pape doing it, which I'm still working on as well. Finkelstein, again, that would take some time, but there's a few in there that we've looked over in the past. Yeah, you just have to be careful, because this conflict is not resolved, and as long as this conflict is not resolved, there are going to be a lot of people with a lot of incentive to just skew the narrative in whichever direction they like. Yeah. Do you have any questions, apart from Sundowner, who's going absolutely ballistic in chat? Do you see a downward trend in people bashing their entire arguments just on quotes that comes from legit sources, or just bad faith interpretation? I mean, quoting is fine. Just make sure, the problem is that a quote is fine if it supports your argument. Like if it actually supports your overall understanding of the source material. But all too often, and what I think happened there, is that this guy found some quotes, probably didn't read the source material for each book. Like, I don't think he read every single book that he was citing. I mean, I haven't even read the full Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem. I still haven't done that. Not done it. Only read a couple of chapters of Scars of War. As for the Palestinian side of the negotiations, I mean, the only full book I've read was Khalid's, and only some of that's to do with the peace process. The other parts that I read were like articles or references to talks between Israeli negotiators and people like Nabil Shath or what's the other person, Saib Arakat, but yeah, you need like a basic understanding of just what the actual contentions are, and then just like some uncontroversial facts about the conflict itself before you go into that, which is why you can avoid saying that Arafat was willing to cede completely the right of return to Israel. Eek. But yeah, this document is, it's up on my Obsidian, so you guys can get it if you want. If you want to read the whole thing, because I did write it out completely. And I'll put it in the description of this video as well, this VOD. Here, I'll give you the link to it. Hello.
Hello.
Hello?
Oh, fuck me. I did not say you did not read anything from the Palestinian side or from the Palestinian negotiation team. Like, that's not my claim. I asked you, who did you read? Because you did not seem to be very, how do you describe it? Knowledgeable about what was, yeah. I'm not saying you are a retard or just a Wikipedia warrior or anything, but I'm saying you did not invest heavily on that regard, and it was showing a bit. So yeah, you can concede that I was correct here.
Yeah, so you just asked it in a passive-aggressive way, I'm just saying. But okay, wait. So on the refugee question, what am I missing, and who wrote it, and where?
Oh, I did not read it as well. I'm fucking retarded on this.
Oh.
I was just saying you did not read it because, like, I know some sources, but honestly, those negotiations themselves bore the fuck out of me. I don't invest in them. Like, there is the book by Saib Arakat. Now, my understanding of the Palestinian negotiations position is that they knew there was never going to be a full right of return like then. But what they said is, okay, we need the right to be recognized.
Mm-hmm.
We need to get as many as we can back. and we don't have to actually give a proper number because this is the thing with negotiations. Whenever you give your cards up, like those cards get undermined. Like for example, with the borders, the PLO said, okay, we want the 67 borders here. Look at it, nice map, 60 map, good borders, and then Israel was like, okay, but first of all, that specific resolution you cite did not actually talk that we should return all the land. Also, the undivided capital of Israel, we can't divide it, you see. It's undivided. It's in the name. And then, but we have a couple of settings, Jews live there. They don't wish to be living in the Palestinian state. They have to be in Israel. So you see how, if you ever give your cards out, those cards are definitely getting undermined. Like if they say, okay, we want 100,000. Israel said, okay, but why 100,000? Why this arbitrary number? What is it solving? Would it solve Lebanon? No, but there will be still many Lebanese Palestinians who are not coming back. Will they still fight us? Like, this is how it goes. So you do not really wish to give your cards up. I understand why they did it. Like, I did not read heavily, but I watched some of the interviews. I read some articles by the people who actually negotiated in it. So I don't have a full narrative, but I can have a bit of grasp on what they said and what were their positions and everything. So yeah.
So
like
that doesn't really that doesn't contradict anything that I've read about it either, though, because like first of all, it's just not as easy to get access to like what fucking Nabil Shath would have to say post Camp David, barring a couple of articles. I've read the Khalidi book, all of it. He was present at these negotiations.
I mean, Khalid is good, but like he was not exactly the best person on the negotiations, I would say.
Yeah, because he was like a
actually
historian, but he was good for. He's actually quite valuable for knowing, because you won't get this from Morris or anyone else. He's valuable for knowing what the delegation at Washington was asking for, the ones who got stonewalled by Yitzhak Shamir. Khalidi is probably like the easiest place you'll get access to actually what they were asking for, and just getting stonewalled by the right wingers. Like that's true. For the refugee question, it's true that like you don't want to give away all your cards at once, but the problem is that at the end of the day, you have to propose some kind of offer, and if it's not committing to a number, then was there ever any like final proposal or any proposal at all or counteroffer from the Palestinians where they said like they were willing to show some kind of like plan for resettlement? So maybe if it's recognized but implement with considerations for demographics, is there going to be anything about how we would actually implement that rather than committing to a hard number? Because I don't think I've seen that. I don't think there was ever actually any counteroffer from the top itself. I've heard suggestions dropped by Nabil Shath and Hania, but not from Arafat himself or from Abbas.
I mean, yeah, you are kind of correct on this, but at the end of the day, they were his delegates. Like they were the one who were going to drop the suggestions and everything. I remember reading an article by Samir Mtawi. He was the Jordanian minister of like media and such. He was very invested in this topic, and I mean, generally, he's one of the better historians and academics on this topic from the Jordanian side. Anyways, I will try to give it up. Yeah, that was most of my point. And also, I started working on the Benny Morris files.
Nice.
No. I'm going to debunk that absolute bastard because, I used to respect him. I really used to, but the more I read his shit, honestly, he's Finkelstein tier, I'm starting to say.
Yeah.
I'm not even joking. He's so fucking bad. Like, you can actually read the stuff he writes about, let's say, when he writes from Israeli archives, he writes about the negotiations and the views within Israel. When he writes about, for example, the military operations and how they went. He's brilliant on that. But take any look at anything else. Like, if he writes about the demographics, the society, the agreements between Arabs, really anything except what I said he's good at, and he's one of the worst historians there is.
Are you talking about negotiations? Are you talking about pre-47 or
pre-47, post-47, all of them?
Okay, well that's really exciting. Okay, because I've not been able to find that myself on the internet, so you should definitely like you got that shit together so I can see it. That's really exciting. That sounds banging. Because
which one?
But what you're talking about?
Negotiations that's what I want to 347?
Yeah, well,
those are a bit difficult.
The fact that you've been talking about this like debunking of Morris for quite a long time. Yeah, I want to see it. I want it in my face.
Okay.
It sounds really exciting because I can
that
do it
was
very
just-
easily
yeah,
for
I
the likes of
actually
I can do it really easily for the likes of Pape and shit like that, just because for some reason those guys are really easy to debunk. But yeah, with Morris, when it's all like archive sources and shit like that, and also just because of his reputation, it's a bit harder. Yeah, especially when the Arab sources are involved. Holy shit!
Yeah, like when he cites an Arab source, it's usually some random god fucker from like 100 years ago, which
Jesus.
has no like electronic copy of this book, so nobody actually knows what he wrote. So like one of the book he cites is one by Bayan al-Hut. Yeah, I could not find any copy on the internet. I had to actually order it from the Beirut University, and because there are some retards in the West Bank picking the transportation up, I'm not getting this until like 2 weeks. I think this shit.
My understanding, coming back to the right of return, just because, my understanding of the right of return is that Palestinians don't seem to want to commit to a final way of addressing it that respects Israel's demographic concerns, because I think any version of right of return that respects Israel's demographic concerns is going to be seen as a betrayal. That's the impression I get from just looking at like sparse interviews and shit like that. That's why I think they're reluctant. I don't think they're reluctant because like, is that false, do you think? Or do you think that's actually a good summary of what they're thinking?
Absolutely, that's great. But honestly, the book I wish someone translates is A Palestinian Without Identity by Salah Khalaf. Do you know who was Salah Khalaf?
Nope.
He was the second in command in the PLO. He was his nom de guerre was Abu Yad. But I actually think he was the best Palestinian to ever lead the movement or anything. Although I disagree with plenty of the shit he did.
Okay.
Anyways,
is he a terrorist?
In his book, of course, like he's Palestinian after all. But he actually did so on that note, he actually did negotiate many of the plane hijackings and released many of the hostages.
Okay.
At one point, he actually offered to exchange the hostages for himself.
That's nice, isn't it?
After the hostage takers said they wished to commit mass suicide, he said, "Okay, exchange the hostages for me." Like this one was like his peak moment. Anyways, so basically, do you know about the PLO? The Covenant of 1969 and 1973.
I've heard of it. Heard bits of it. Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, this is where when right wingers always go. Israeli right wingers always go. Okay, Palestinians don't want a two-state solution, but what they actually say, they want it as a stepping stone so that they could take over all the land. You know this argument?
Yep.
Well, it's true. That's what the Covenant actually said. But it was not as simple as that, because like it seems that okay, we take this land and then we start a bunch of terror attacks. But what it actually said is you take this land, you make peace, and then you try to achieve some sort of one-state solution throughout negotiations. You have to build the relations, you have to build bridges. That's what it actually was going for, and that's what Salah Khalaf in his book actually elaborated on.
Yeah, I've heard that argument before.
So,
that used to be an argument I would make. It's like pursue two states and then use that to bridge one state. Mostly because the borders are just very unnatural, right? And if those two countries were ever at peace together, it would be very easy to soften those borders. At which point you'd be like, eventually, maybe in like a few generations, you're like, what's the point?
Yeah, that's actually, this is my position overall. Like, this is why I kind of like Salah Khalaf. Anyways, after he made this, so it basically said two-state solutions, and then we try to figure it out. After he made this, he went to one of the refugee camps in Lebanon, and the refugees there were all loyalists to the, I think it was, I forgot which camp was it, but they were all loyalists to the rejectionists, the Democratic Front, the Popular Front, those retards.
Yeah.
So all of them were there, like mocking him and saying, "Why the fuck do you want us to actually give up our houses, give up our lands, give up everything we have?" Keep in mind, this was 25 years after the Nakba, so most of them were alive when it happened. Like most of them witnessed it. It's not as if you speak here. Yeah, and he started shouting at them, "You have been displaced for 25 years." Maybe I can get the quote up here right now. She started like screaming at them, "You have been displaced for 25 years. We are offering you a state. We are offering you a good life. We are offering you everything, and you still reject it." But the thing is that they still don't like, and he elaborated on it. saying, well, they did not view fucking Ramallah or Nablus as their homeland. They viewed Jaffa, they viewed Lad as their homeland. So they would not accept anything less than that. So yeah, especially in Lebanon and Syria, the refugees there, like they just want their return. They would not accept anything less. While in Jordan, even to the West Bank or Gaza, for example, no, most people would not do it because most people are already resettled. Like I would not do it. You could not pay me enough. Yeah,
you know what?
So
there
this is how it goes.
was one thing I wanted to read because I've heard it referenced, but I've never actually seen the original source. This is Akram Haniya talking about why he had that position on refugees regarding choice, like what he actually spelled out. Do you know what I'm talking about? The Camp David papers from Akram Haniya?
I came across them, but as I said, I was not really invested in the Camp David and Annapolis and that shit. Yeah.
It's quite...
I did not invest heavily in it.
Let me see. I don't know if it elaborates that much about the detail. Throughout the sessions, Palestinians waited for Barak to pull the rabbit out of the hat. What they got was the following. The Refugee Committee was the most difficult, strangest, and most unsuccessful. In this committee, the Palestinian vision clashed hard with the Israeli vision. In the absence of seriousness on the part of Israel, the discussion revolved mostly around the past and not the present or the future. The clash and difference between the two visions goes back to the Palestinian Nakba or catastrophe to its very roots. It was the most difficult committee because it was the real committee ruled by history. There's an Arabic thing there, so I don't know if that's proper translation. Ruled by history, and because it placed Israel at the center of the Palestinian question. It placed Israel in front of her victims, in front of the witnesses to the crime of the homeowners. It was strange because Israel continued to deny the crime. There is a complete denial of the Nakba and of Israeli responsibility in causing it. It was the Palestinian negotiator who must be convinced that there were no massacres or campaigns of terror, expulsion, and house demolitions, and that the Arab countries should be blamed for the Nakba, who, according to Israel, convinced the Palestinians to leave their homes and wait for liberation. And when the Israelis were presented with the memoirs and the testimony of their own generals, they rejected them. This must be early on, because I'm sure Yossi Beilin, in his thing, was willing to make concessions on acknowledging Israel's responsibility for the crisis. But
no, but I just I wish to see the look in their faces when they are like trying to make a straight face while convincing them, yeah, bro, the Arabs told you to fuck off, when they are the generation that was kicked out. My God.
It was the most unsuccessful committee because it did not move 1 inch forward. Israel refused to take moral and legal responsibility for the Nakba. There is only a willingness to express sorrow over what befell the Palestinians as a result of the Israeli war of 1948, and because talk of the right of return was a taboo for Israel, tantamount to a declaration of a war of destruction of Israel. There was a rejection of any talk of putting a timetable for the implementation of the return. All that Israel would talk about was compensation for the refugees, not from its pocket, but from the pocket of the international community, and parts of the funds would be used to compensate Jews who came to Israel from Arab communities. Israel only committed itself to allowing several thousands to return within 10 years through family reunification and humanitarian cases. But I wonder what his... if he does comments on what he actually would have been okay with. Because the impression I get, and when he's talking about this, like the tribunal or whatever of international opinion, it always sounds like the more important thing is not even a particular number. It's just like, it's like a closure. That's what it always seems like it's coming back to. But I don't know.
Actually holds a mate, because much of it is more sentimental than practical, really. Like, there is a practical merit for example, when we talk about Lebanon or Syrian refugees, but for most of us it's sentimental. Like, for the ones in Jordan, they don't really win. At least none I know actually wants to return, but for the ones in Lebanon, they want to return. But in Jordan, well, we were kicked out of our villages and shit. We want this to be recognized, at least accept your responsibility. And, you know, maybe a little bit of compensation. Like, I think it's a bit, I'd say it's bad taste to actually ask for compensations or anything. But I think it's also our right. It's the rightful thing to do.
This is what I think.
So, yeah.
From my impression, for what you just said...
I personally would never actually accept any sort of compensation or ask for it. But others would do, and I can't really say they didn't have the right for it.
See, the impression I get from what you just said and from talking to other Palestinians, the impression I get is that a satisfactory right of return deal for Palestinians would be if Israel offers the right to return to everyone, but just so that most of them can say no to it. That actually seems like what they'd be happy with. Like just the right to be off, just the right to say no, fuck you, or like no, I'm fine staying where I am. Like I don't know. That just seems like the
actually,
which is so silly. But like
I can't generalize, but that's actually for me. Like that's what I would go for.
I'm going to be really white now.
Look,
I'm going to be really white. I'm going to be white as fuck. Okay, I'm going to ask you. Do you think this has anything to do with like honor culture, like a restoration of pride or whatever?
Yeah, for many it is.
Okay.
Because if they still keep telling us, "Oh, go fuck yourself, nothing happened," the Arabs told you to run off, and you will run off like pussies, and yeah, like it would leave a sore taste, and that would be a bit overwhelming. So yeah. Okay, so I sent you a couple of books I had. I did not read all of them, but they are on the negotiations in the period pre-47 and post-47. You ask for them. Yeah,
where are you doing this doc? Oh, Jesus Christ! Where are you doing this document about the Benny Morris? Are you doing it like on Obsidian or fucking Google Docs or what?
I'm doing it on Obsidian, but the thing is that I was doing it on my iPad. I saw that iPad, so I kind of lost all of this shit, and I have to do it all over again.
Man, this is so banging. I look forward to reading all this. Look at it. It's these are definitely words. These are some solid words you've sent me here.
Yeah, they are very wordy.
Every other word starts with al. I know that. Okay, Aleph, Lam, nice. Al-Maj. Okay.
I would say one thing is with those sources you have to be very careful because they are not exactly the most credible. Like I have this theory about every single book in the conflict. They all suck. They all suck ass, but they are good at very specific thing you can actually cite them for, and ignore everything else. That's how it goes. That when you are citing here, I found some mistakes in it, but overall it's one of the better ones really, and it's rather small, so it's not that big of a deal. I'm trying to get one that was made about the Palestine paper, you know, the ones that got leaked in 2012.
Yep.
Or 2011, yeah. Because that shit sounds interesting, but really informations about it are scarce. I don't know why.
This is about Clinton sitting with negotiators from two sides to discuss refugees. The positions on both sides were in a collision course. The Palestinian position was clear and decisive. After a brief presentation about the root of the refugee dilemma, explained through a review in history of the Jewish invasion of Palestine. That's a nice way to put it. Palestinian negotiators asserted...
No. I have to actually... what did you say earlier? Like, what's explain it or something? I have to explain this for you. Like, we are racist, you know. Racism is not like we do plenty of shit if we generalize it. Like so, for example, so I actually say the Jewish invasion of Palestine. That's very normal. It's not really anti-Semitic.
When they say Jewish invasion, are they talking about the 48 war? Or are they talking about like 1917 onwards? Because I've heard people talk about the Jewish invasion starting in 17, right?
No, I don't believe anyone would call that an invasion. Like they would call colonialism or some shit about it, but I have never heard it being talked about as an invasion. For the most part, that period is not really acknowledged. It's mostly described as the British mandate, the Zionist presence, and the Zionist project at that time was not really acknowledged in Palestinian academic spaces, except for the few that actually know what the fuck they are talking about.
Didn't the Palestinian National Charter describe 1917 as the beginning of the Zionist invasion, or is that a mistranslation?
Which national charter?
What's it called? The Palestinian National Charter, Resolutions of the Palestine National Council, July 1968. The Jews who had normally resided in Palestine until the beginning of the Zionist invasion will be considered Palestinians. I think the name of the Zionist invasion, they're talking about 17, no? What document is this one, though? This isn't the same as the fucking covenant, is it?
I would have to actually see what's the wording for the actual...
Oh, I think, but you're saying it's not common for people to say that. Okay.
Not common. I never actually heard it being said as such. Usually that's not the term we use. It sounds really stupid, and it sounds really cocked for us as Arabs, you know, bad culture and shit. So yeah, I found the covenant. Okay, which...
I think it says Article 6, but I don't know if this is the covenant. This is the Palestine. Is that what it's called? The Palestine National Charter, Article 6. But again, I don't think they actually date what the Zionist invasion is. It's just people assume it's 1917.
No, actually, it says It doesn't date it, but the previous date in the article before, it says 1947. So I assume this is the invasion they are referring to.
Oh, 19. So
The
what does Article 6 translate to?
No, it says the Zionist invasion, but it doesn't date it. While the article before it talks about the Palestinians are the Arab citizens that resided in the territory until 1947.
Is this the
so like the article before it gives the date. So if we wish to base or infer from it what is the date they refer to, it would probably be that.
Interesting.
So because not even the most radical or extreme PLO member actually wish to say that the Jews who were did reside during the mandate period were in fact like the Jews who came during the mandate were in fact not Palestinian citizens or should be expelled or anything. Not even the most radical or extreme of them I have heard saying that.
Yeah, because
like,
even
this
when you
might talk about people like George Habash or Naif Hawatmi.
This might be. I wonder. Wait, apparently there was a United Nations translation of it that said that as well, but it's it's a 504 page now. So that's weird because it might. You know what it might be? It might be the what do you call it? It might be the fucking Jewish virtual library being cringe again, which is not untoward. The Zionist invasion. Oh, so they're talking about 47.
Yeah, as I always say, you cannot trust the Jews.
Okay. Wow. Okay. So this is apparently the following points. An insistence on the right of every Palestinian refugee to return home as stipulated in Resolution 194. Okay, that's... Establishment of a mechanism to implement this right and to begin the implementation with the return of refugees in Lebanon, and then establish a timetable including numbers for the return of all those who wish to do so. The Palestinians then explained why they were giving priority to the refugees in Lebanon. Their conditions are dire and they are linked through kinship with the Galilee, which was obvious at the Fatma Gatia reunions, I don't know what that means, in South Lebanon, which was broadcast.
Actually, I think the most important reason that he would never cite is because those like the Palestinians in Lebanon are hot-headed as fuck. Like they would not accept any other resolution.
Oh yeah.
Like you could actually say, okay, guys, here we come. You can go to the UK, get a fucking palace, and have citizenship and everything you want. Just fuck off from here, and they would still reject it. That's their worldview.
Yeah, interesting. It would be possible after the recognition of the right of return and mechanism of implementing that right to establish a process of compensation, as they want return and compensation. Okay. Refusal to discuss the issue of Jews who left the Arab countries and their compensation. We do not recognize the right of... in the face of the Palestinian position, there was the classic Israeli argument, we are not responsible for the problem. Yeah, we're prepared to allow thousands to return. During that meeting, Clinton no doubt felt that the refugee issue is much more complicated than what his advisors informed him. You know what? I might read this whole thing one day because it's...
What was it called? You said?
This is...
I read it before.
It's Camp David Papers by Akram Husseini. No, Hania, not Husseini. Akram Hania.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because Husseini would never say this shit.
No. Okay, shit.
Okay, see you later.
Okay, bye-bye.